They abandoned the alien princess in chains, but the human broke into a war zone to free her. The footage was classified. Even High Command wasn't supposed to see it, but it leaked anyway. A grainy, looping clip of the alien princess bloodied, shackled, and thrown into a concrete cell like an animal. Her species was blamed for the war, her voice silenced with titanium chains. The Senate called her a threat. The generals called her an asset, but one human called her something else, his friend. And when he saw what they'd done to her, he stole a ship, crossed enemy lines, and headed straight into a battlefield to get her back, even if it killed him. The cell stank of rust, recycled air, and blood, none of it hers anymore, but all of it part of her now, and as the alien princess lay shackled to the cold slab of metal they called a bed. Eyes unfocused, staring at the flickering blue light above, she wondered for the 1,000th time how long it would take for anyone, to decide whether she lived or died. Not for her crimes, because she had committed none, but for her existence, her lineage, her refusal to die quietly when the universe had demanded silence. Once, her voice had carried across galactic chambers, had paused arguments between species that hadn't shared words in centuries, had inspired peace proposals and terrified warmongers. But now, stripped of title, wrapped in damp rags and bound with triple reinforced cuffs bolted to the slab, she was little more than a prisoner left to rot in an off-grid military facility that wasn't supposed to exist, not officially, not anymore. Buried beneath the ruins of outpost Virik 17 were broken protocols and buried truths went to disappear, her name no longer spoken, her face scrubbed from media, her identity rewritten in classified files that marked her simply as Lysari Asset Number 2049. Dangerous, non-compliant, but she remembered her name, even if no one else did, and she repeated it in her head each morning as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate another forgotten sunrise, because it was all she had left that they hadn't taken. Though they tried, with long interrogations, neural disruptors, deprivation cycles designed to strip her memories and crush her will, and still she remained unmoved, unbroken, because to die quietly would be to prove them right. And the only thing left worth believing in was the idea that someone, somewhere, still knew the truth of her innocence, still remembered who she was before the war burned everything down, and in the quiet between interrogations, when the guards were gone and only the humming of power coils filled the stale air. She thought of him, the human soldier who had fought beside her during the last siege, who had bled defending civilians in her name, who had stood against his own command to stop a mass orbital strike on a Lysari city, who had once told her, during a moment of stillness between mortar blasts and falling ash, that if the galaxy ever turned on her, he wouldn't. His name was Kade Delren, and he had smiled like someone who had already lost too much but still chose to care. And though it had been nearly 3 cycles since she last saw him, since the betrayal, since the council voted to surrender her in exchange for a ceasefire that only lasted 12 hours, she still remembered his voice, steady and rough and honest, promising that she wasn't alone. Not really, not if he was still breathing, and she clung to that. Fragile though it was, because everything else had been stripped away when they threw her into this cell, shackled her wrists and ankles, forced her to her knees in front of generals who spat accusations in every language but truth, and now even the guards barely came anymore. Afraid or disgusted, she couldn't tell, only that they left her food through a retractable slot in the wall and wouldn't meet her eyes when they entered for maintenance or medical scans. And she had grown used to the silence, used to the ache, used to the heavy weight of being forgotten, but that changed the day the alarms began to scream. Not the usual low warning hums, but full station lockdown klaxons, sharp and blaring and red, the kind of sound that said something was wrong. Something real, not just drills or exercises or psychological manipulations. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, someone ran past her cell door shouting into a comlink, voice sharp and panicked. Sector 6 breach, repeat, unauthorized incursion on lower deck. Possible friendly uniform, but comms are dead. He's moving fast. And she sat up slowly, heart slamming against her ribs, breath catching in her throat, because something in that voice, that phrasing, that panic, it didn't sound like a Lissari counter-operation. And certainly not coalition business. It sounded like a ghost, and when her cell door didn't open, she told herself it was nothing, just another hallucination born from hunger and isolation. And still her body trembled like it remembered something. Her mind didn't want to hope for, and then the lights in the ceiling began to short out one by one, plunging the corridor into darkness, the flickering cascade of blue to black like her curtain falling on the end of a stage act. And she could hear footsteps now, not the cold, mechanical cadence of patrols, but the heavy, desperate tread of boots pounding the floor. Closer, closer, and then silence, and then a bang, a sudden whine of plasma cutting into alloy, and the sealed bulkhead leading to her wing exploded inward in a blast of heat and smoke and sparking metal, and standing in the doorway, battered and bloodied and out of breath, wearing an old combat vest scorched along the edges and a rifle slung low over one shoulder, was Kade Delren, looking like death had tried to keep him but couldn't quite hold on. His eyes locked on her as if she were the only thing in the galaxy that mattered. And she couldn't move, couldn't speak, only stare as he crossed the threshold and raised his hand, voice shaking as he said, "Told you I'd come back." And then he was kneeling by her shackles, fingers working at the locks, swearing under his breath about outdated military override codes. And she still hadn't said anything because the moment felt too wide, too impossible, like if she moved it would vanish. But when the cuffs finally clicked open and her wrists fell free, she didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around him and sobbed. Not from pain, but from the weight that finally lifted, and he held her tightly, carefully, whispering something she couldn't hear over the fire alarms and distant gunfire, something that felt like safety. And then he was lifting her gently, cradling her against his chest as he carried her out of the shattered cell, boots crunching on broken glass and fallen fixtures, and they moved through corridors torn by gunfire and ruptured panels, dodging drones that no longer responded to commands, cutting through smoke and debris as the base fought to repel what it still believed was an organized Lissari retrieval squad, but it wasn't a squad. It was just one human, one man who had defied his chain of command, stolen a gunship, bypassed 3 blockade zones, and walked through a war zone because a promise meant something to him, because she had once believed in him when no one else did, because he refused to let her vanish into the cracks of a war they both knew had never ended cleanly. And as they reached the secondary exit point, the one he'd pre-hacked to cycle open long enough for a shuttle escape, she realized she could barely walk, her legs weakened from confinement and malnourishment. And he didn't hesitate, he just tightened his grip and ran, carrying her like a soldier carried a flag through hell. The roar of emergency lockdown barriers slamming shut behind them, the sound of automated turrets coming online too late. And as they reached the bay, the doors burst open and wind howled through the chamber, the landing pad outside already scorched from his rough entry. And he staggered onto it just as fire rained down from the upper tiers where coalition snipers had finally zeroed in, but they were too late, because he was already moving, already boarding the ship, already sealing the hatch as blasts pounded the outer hull. And when the shuttle tore into the sky seconds later, leaving fire and chaos behind, the station shrank beneath them, just another burning scar on a world filled with them, and the alien princess, still weak, still in pain, leaned her head against his chest as he piloted through flak and pursuit vectors, whispering her name like a secret he'd waited too long to say out loud. And for the first time in months, she smiled, not because they were safe, but because someone still remembered. The sky above Virik 17 wasn't a sky anymore. It was a torn curtain of flame and smoke, a thundering theater of cannon bursts, orbital debris, and scrambling interceptors still loyal to the Coalition's dead laws. And as Kade wrestled the battered shuttle out of the gravity, while with alarms screaming at him from all angles, oxygen leak in the lower panel, hull stress overload, weapons locked from grid drones spinning up on the far flank, he knew they weren't out yet, not by a long shot, and beside him, still barely conscious, the alien princess clung to the harness of the co-pilot seat with one hand and to the edge of lucidity with the other. Her eyes flickering open every few seconds, her body weak from captivity and strain but still upright, still alive, and that alone meant more to Kade than any medal ever had, because he'd seen too many good things lost to silence and shame in this damned war. Too many voices buried under the term acceptable losses, and he had sworn she wouldn't be one of them, not her. Not the one who had stood before fleets and dared them to fire, not the one who'd pulled his bleeding body from a bunker collapse during the siege of Terrans. While even when it meant exposing herself to sniper fire, he owed her more than this rushed escape. More than a backdoor flight plan cobbled together from half-dead satellites and old maps, but it was all he had. And so he pushed the shuttle's thrusters until they screamed, veering low into the debris belt that circled the war-racked continent. Like a crown of broken teeth, dodging shattered ship husks and fragments of long dead. Skirmishes in the hopes the automated sentries couldn't track them through the junk field's magnetic interference. And every time he thought they might be in the clear, another lock pings. Another proximity warning flashed red across the panel. Another drone appeared in the mirror like a ghost too late for vengeance but early enough to try, and he had to swerve again, pulling G's that made his vision blur and his knuckles pale on the flight stick, all while muttering calculations under his breath. Old pilot math born from survival instinct more than training. He hadn't flown military in years, not since discharge, not since he'd walked away from command and the endless rotation of grief briefings and sanitized bloodshed, but it was all coming back now, muscle memory sharp, instincts alive, and with each juke and barrel roll, he edged them closer to the shadow of a dead relay moon where he'd stashed a backup warp drive weeks ago. Just in case, because part of him had always known it might come to this, and behind him, the princess stirred again, eyes opening fully this time, and she spoke not in desperation or confusion, but calm. Her voice cracked and hoarse but unmistakably hers, and it hit him like a gravity anchor when she said his name. Kade, soft and certain like he'd never left. And for a moment, everything outside the hull faded, the blasts, the warning beacons, even the pounding in his chest, and he glanced back at her, just long enough to see her blinking against the dim emergency lights, her hand tightening slightly on the console, and he said, "You're all right." More for himself than her, and she gave the smallest nod, followed by a whisper that was half-breath, "You're late," and he laughed, short and cracked, but real, because of course she would still find room for defiance in the middle of hell. And that sound, that impossible exchange, gave him enough energy to push them through the final stretch of the debris belt, the shuttle's hull groaning under the strain as they punched through the gravity shelf of the ruined moon, where his emergency cache had remained undisturbed hidden beneath a crater lined with scrap panels and signal jammers, and he brought the shuttle in low, bouncing once on the crust before skidding to a stop, vents hissing, hydraulics bleeding pressure into the freezing air, and as he powered down everything but internal life support and killed the beacon, he stood, legs stiff, shoulder screaming from a blast ricochet he hadn't even noticed in the heat of flight, and made his way back to her, kneeling beside the seat to check her pulse, her pupils, her bones, all while she stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just another hallucination sent by a mind too exhausted to keep the truth straight. And when he tried to lift her again, she stopped him with a hand to his arm, not weak, not desperate, but steady, and said, "I can walk." And though it took her longer than either of them would have liked, she stood, one shaky foot after another, and the two of them stepped. down into the frigid dusk of the dead moon, where the silence of vacuum and war's aftermath stretched endlessly around them. The only sound their breathing and the distant groan of the cooling hull, and as they reached the small maintenance hatch hidden beneath a pile of jagged solar panels, Kade keyed in his code, and it opened to reveal a tight crawl space filled with backup gear, a portable nav core, rations, weapons, and most importantly, a prototype warp module salvaged from a decommissioned stealth ship, something fast enough to jump them beyond Virik 17's long-range sensors and get them into disputed neutral zones where no official would dare follow without a full diplomatic vote. He started working fast, installing the drive, rerouting power conduits, checking fuel levels while she sat nearby, catching her breath, her back against the cold stone. And after a long while, she finally spoke again, this time without the haze. "They were never going to release me, were they?" And he paused, hands still, shoulders heavy, then answered honestly, "No, you were the scapegoat. They needed someone to blame for the ceasefire collapse. And you were the only one left who couldn't fight back." And she said nothing for a while, just stared out into the skies' dark, and then asked, "And you? Why come back?" And that hurt more than he expected that she had to ask, but he swallowed it down and said, "Because you mattered. Because I don't leave people behind. Because if they're going to write history, I'd rather die knowing I didn't let them lie." And she turned her head slowly toward him, eyes sharper now, brighter despite the shadows under them, and whispered, "They told me everyone gave up." And he replied, "I didn't." And in the silence that followed, something passed between them, not romance, not yet, but something older and deeper, trust reforged in fire. And when he finished the installation and powered up the new warp module, the nav screen lit green for the first time in days, and they both climbed back aboard, sealing the hatch as the system ran a silent jump countdown. And though they both knew the next few minutes could kill them if any part failed, they stayed quiet, shoulder to shoulder in the tiny cockpit, breathing together in sync as the stars began to blur and the engines hummed with gathering energy. And then, just before the stars bent into a smear, she reached for his hand, not to hold it, but just to touch it, as if confirming that he was still real, still here, and that, for now, was enough. The jump tore them through folded space like a thread through jagged metal, the warp module rattling so hard Kade thought the seals would rupture. And for 10 long seconds the ship screamed with the stress of an improvised hyperfold, every alarm blinking red, oxygen pressure dipping, artificial gravity stuttering, the console flickering as if even the nav AI couldn't decide whether to stay conscious or black out. But then the stars snapped back into place, cruel and cold and infinite beyond the viewport, and for the first time in hours there was silence. Not the kind that follows defeat, but that rare, trembling hush that comes after surviving something neither of them should have walked away from. And Kade slumped back in the pilot seat with his hands shaking slightly, the adrenaline wearing off now, the pain in his side from the earlier impact sharp and deep, but manageable. And beside him, the alien princess slowly unstrapped herself, still gaunt and pale from captivity, but already sitting straighter than she had on Virik 17, her eyes focused again, her presence returning like a tide. She didn't ask where they were, because she didn't need to, not yet. Not when every inch of her body still felt like it was vibrating from the jump, but when the silence lingered too long. She finally turned to him and asked, voice low, "Was that the chiefy plan?" And Kade laughed, cracked and breathless, wiping blood from his lip as he replied, "Hell no. I was hoping for something with less hull stress and more brakes." And she almost smiled, but it faded quickly as she looked down at her hands, the faint bruises from the cuffs still marking her skin, and said, "They'll come for us." And he nodded. Because they both knew the truth, there was no way the coalition would let her escape without consequence. not after what she'd seen, not after what she knew, and certainly not after a decorated ex-soldier broke into one of their black sites to rip her out like a burning secret. And as the ship drifted through a stretch of deep space just outside the Veridin dust halo, Kade activated stealth mode, powered down the active transponder, and began scanning nearby relay stations looking for an unregulated cum node, a place where they could make contact without drawing military attention because there was someone. They needed to reach her people, or what was left of them, the Lisari, scattered remnants of an empire that had once spanned 6 systems but now clung to shadows and memory, hunted and defamed, abandoned by the very allies they'd bled to protect. And while Kade rerouted systems and encrypted outgoing pings, the alien princess moved slowly through the small vessel, her bare feet quiet on the grates as she reacquainted herself with motion, with light, with being somewhere that didn't echo with prison bars or interrogation chairs. And eventually she found a small medkit tucked into the wall compartment, not for herself, but for him, because now that the fire was gone from his adrenaline, he was pale and sweating and holding his side like it was trying to split open, and when she opened his jacket, her face hardened, because the deep plasma burn across his ribs had soaked half his shirt. And he hadn't said a word about it, had been running on fumes and willpower for hours without mentioning the pain. Because of course he had, and she made him sit, made him drink the stabilizer, made him let her clean and dress the wound, and, though they didn't talk much during it, there was something heavy in the way she touched his skin, not romantic, not yet, but intimate in the way trauma understands trauma, in the way pain recognizes loyalty, and when she finished, she rested, her forehead against his for a moment longer than needed. A silent thank you, maybe, or a promise she couldn't yet voice, and then the console pinged, low and sharp, and Kade pulled himself to his feet, grimacing as he returned to the flight deck where the scanner now displayed an old comms buoy. Floating near the edge of a ghost field, an asteroid ring once used as cover for pirate activity. Now just a graveyard of forgotten ships and broken deals, and he set a course, careful and deliberate, coasting on low M output so no patrols would pick them up. And the princess returned to the co-pilot's chair, watching him with a quiet intensity that said she knew what was coming next wouldn't be as easy as escape, because survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning of exposure, of decisions, of truth, and when they finally reached the buoy and linked into its old Lisari encryption, the silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, but it was only 10 seconds before a voice came through, warbled and thin, speaking in the old Tonga language the galaxy had tried to erase, and the princess replied in kind, her voice stronger now, and the voice on the other end choked before saying, "Your Highness, we thought you were dead," and her answer, quiet and calm, was, "They wanted you to," and after that, everything changed. The small rebel cells still loyal to the Lisari royal bloodline mobilized immediately, sending coordinates, routes, a rendezvous point deep in the asteroid field where Kade and the princess could dock with an old hauler retrofitted for stealth, and though Kade wanted to trust them, he couldn't shake the paranoia because this was the part where things fell. A part where people betrayed their own to survive, and as he followed the nav data and threaded them through narrow asteroid tunnels, he kept his finger near the emergency jump trigger because if they walked into a trap now, there would be no second chances, but the rendezvous was clean. And when the hauler extended its docking clamps and sealed their ship to its bay, no shots fired, no demands barked, he let himself exhale just once, and then they stepped aboard, side by side, and were met not with guns, but with silence, reverent and heavy, as a dozen Lisari, many older, some young, stared at her like they were seeing a ghost. And when one of them, a broad-shouldered commander with half his face scarred by war, dropped to his knees and said, "You lived," her voice did not shake as she replied, "Because he came," and they looked at Kade then, truly looked at him. And he saw it in their faces, the disbelief, the awe, the gratitude wrapped in suspicion, but none of them raised a weapon. And that was enough for now. And as the Lissari began preparations to move again, to flee deeper into the fractured belts where no scanner dared search, the princess and Kade retreated to a quiet room in the crew quarters where they sat for a long time in silence, the air humming gently with the vibration of the ship. And finally she said, "You didn't have to come for me." And he answered, "You were never just a prisoner to me." And she closed her eyes then, as if something deep inside her had finally found rest. But when she opened them again, they were sharper, resolved, and she said, "We can't keep running." And he knew then that escape was never the plan. That survival was only the first spark of a fire that would burn through everything that tried to hide the truth of what was done to her, of what the war had cost, and of the humans who had chosen to forget, but not him, never him, because some stories don't end in silence, and some rescues are only the beginning of a reckoning that no power can bury. The signal went out in fragments, at first intermittent pulses encoded in an ancient Lissari dialect that hadn't been spoken in diplomatic chambers for years, layered with a forgotten encryption protocol only those loyal to the true bloodline could still translate, and yet it spread quietly, like a fire beneath the ash of a scorched galaxy, whispering across shattered combuoys and forgotten relay hubs, bouncing between outlaw traders, defected command crews, and war survivors who had long since buried their uniforms but not their beliefs. And with every passing hour, more ships began to change course, not en masse, not loud or defiant, but subtle. A scout frigate suddenly abandoning its patrol route to drift just within reach of a shadow broadcast, a freighter rerouting to a moon that hadn't hosted life in over a decade, and a dozen listening posts intercepting the same message. The princess lives, she speaks. The truth has returned. And those words, spoken in her voice, fractured and scarred but unmistakable, ignited something even the coalition censors couldn't stamp out, because the war had ended in signatures, not justice. And now, after so many years of silence, the figure they'd tried to erase had stepped back into the galaxy, not with a vengeance, but with a testimony. Aboard the Lissari hauler buried deep in the fractured edge of the Veridin belt, the alien princess stood tall again, not healed, not whole, but alive, and beside her, Kade Delren moved like a ghost in armor, ever present, never speaking in meetings unless directly asked, always watching the entrances, the power flow, the escape vectors, like he knew the galaxy wasn't done trying to crush what little they had left, and maybe it never would be. But even so, he stayed. Through long nights of encoded transmissions and tense discussions with exiled Lissari commanders who didn't all agree on what her survival meant. Some wanted to raise a fleet, others to disappear forever, but she was clear. This wasn't about reclaiming a throne, or vengeance, or restoration of empire. It was about making sure what was done to her, what was done to so many, was never allowed to happen again. Not hidden, not rewritten, and for that, she needed to be seen, truly seen. And so the broadcasts continued holograms of her recounting the backroom diplomacy that traded her life for peace, footage of her shackled in the dark cell they swore didn't exist, recordings of coalition generals discussing her as an expendable asset, and though at first the major networks refused to air it, afraid of violating ceasefire protocols, it was too late. The Undernet caught it, streamed it, translated it into 47 languages, and across the Rim colonies and inner systems alike, something shifted. Subtly but powerfully, young recruits began questioning their orders. Former Lissari collaborators publicly apologized, and on one fringe planet, an entire garrison refused to report for duty until a tribunal reviewed the legitimacy of her imprisonment. This wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was rupture, and the higher-ups knew it, and within days, a kill order was quietly issued not for her, but for him, because even after everything, they still thought she could be silenced if they severed the bond that kept her from falling, and Kade saw it coming. Not from a data leak or informant, but in the pattern of the patrols that crept closer to their position, in the code phrases, slipping into transmissions from supposed sympathizers, in the bounty pings that were too specific to be random, and when he brought it to her. Late one night while the others slept, he didn't ask for a decision. He just told her the truth. They won't stop until one of us is gone. And she looked at him like he was already drifting away, already preparing to vanish again for her sake, and she said nothing for a long moment, only took his hand rough, scarred, still healing from the burn on his ribs, and placed it over her chest, over the faint pulse beneath her skin, and whispered, "Then we don't run anymore." And it was the first time she had said "we" without hesitation, and so they stayed. Even when a squad of coalition operatives boarded the mining station that hosted their next signal broadcast, even when an ambush nearly caught them on the old repair deck, even when Kade took a bullet to the shoulder pulling a Lissari technician out of a collapsing access tunnel, they stayed and fought and kept speaking. And the truth kept spreading until it reached the unlikeliest of places, a retired human admiral, once decorated, now disgraced, who came forward with signed orders proving her handover was not only premeditated, but designed to incite a second conflict. And when that reached the assembly floor on Primaris 1, everything cracked. The vote passed in secret to issue an inquiry, then a hearing, and within weeks, the same channels that once erased her name now broadcast it with formal reverence. Princess Velisari of Lissari ascendancy, survivor, diplomat, witness to war crimes, and when she walked into that hearing chamber, flanked not by soldiers or guards but by Kade himself, wearing no rank, no insignia, just scars and defiance, the room fell silent, and she testified, calmly, clearly, and completely, her voice no longer shaking, and the effect was instant. Political heads rolled. 2 coalition executives were arrested for obstruction, and Virik 17's official records were declassified and publicly condemned. But when the hearings ended, and the galaxy began its long, slow march towards something like honesty, she didn't take up a throne or rebuild a palace. She took a single Lissari scout vessel and vanished into deep space with Kade beside her. And for a while no one heard from them, and stories began to bloom in their absence. Some said they were founding a new colony where Lissari and humans could live side by side. Others that they were still broadcasting the truth from an untraceable beacon, still teaching, still fighting for forgotten names, and years later, when a freighter captain stumbled across a monument carved into the surface of a moon without a name, he found only a statue, 2 figures, side by side, one with a crown shattered in her palm, the other holding a rifle pointed downward into the earth, with an inscription below in both Lissari and Earth standard that read, "You can erase a name, but not the one who remembered it." And above it, carved deeper into the stone, were just 2 words, "She lived," and beside it, in smaller script, "He stayed." And somewhere beyond that moon, beyond the rim of known space, a ship still drifts between stars, carrying 2 souls bound not by duty or politics or blood, but by choice, the kind that holds through silence, fire, war, and memory, until the very end.